Jimmy's here, and I think Marty may have stepped out, but it's a story that goes back to 1992 in the Sterling Axle plant. For those of you that don't know, the Sterling Axle plant in the Ford Motor Company is a very complicated plant. Jimmy, Marty, if you had to describe the Sterling Axle plant, what would you say?
3 million square feet of oil, dust, and haze. Building the real drive axles that are the big point of the company.
Yeah. So almost half of all Ford vehicles ever built have an axle from the Sterling Axle plant. It's about a $3 billion a year business with about 3,000 people. And the reason I mention it is that the story I want to tell you is about back in around 91 or 92, they had just launched the first workplace teams for a team-based operation in the PN96 axle area. And we had identified 3 of the team leaders to give a briefing 1 year into it on their experience, and they were briefing the plant operating committee of management and the plant bargaining committee on the union side to describe what was going on. So the first 2 team leaders got up and they praised this new team-based system. They said people have more of a say about their job. People are actually owning the business on quality and safety, and that it was just a better way to work, and they had all good things to say to the plant leadership. The third fellow on the panel got up and said, "Is it okay if I tell you what I really think?" And there was sort of a pause, and then the chairman, it was Frank Savali then at the time, said, "Well, sure." And the plant manager said, "Yeah, by all means, speak your mind." And so he said, "Well, the truth is that when we have a problem with safety or quality or something else, you guys are all over it. You're here, you're trying to solve the problem, and that's great." He said, "But when things are going well, we generally don't see you." He said, "Don't just wait for problems to come and fix them. When things are okay, come around and help us to continuously improve." The reason I tell the story is for 2 reasons. One, as a nation, we are coming out of a recession, one of the worst in the history of this nation, and we're in a period of time where things are starting to get better, and that's not the time to step back and say, well, now things are okay. It's the time to show up to these folks who are on the front lines and say, how can we help improve? But more than that, the focus of my remarks this morning is going to be at the level of systems, at the level of institutions, and particularly the institution of collective bargaining. And I think that we need to be looking at collective bargaining not just when the labor management relationship goes off the rails and you have a relationship that's spinning out of control, but how to take a relationship even when it's productive and healthy and help it to transform into something that is even more impactful and realizes its full potential in society. So that's what I want to cover in these opening remarks. By the way, the slides here, Bill has a copy of them, and so if anyone wants a copy of the slides, I'm happy to make them available to you. But to set the stage for the remarks, there's basically 4 principles that I'd like to articulate, and then I'm going to take you first of all into a brief journey into what it is to think about institutions like collective bargaining and others in new ways. And then the second part is we actually have some data. We did how many of you took the pre-survey that we sent out? So about a third of the people here. I believe that when you do a survey, you need to share the results and let people see what they said. And so I actually have the results from the first 19 respondents to the survey. And you'll see that what it does is it sort of holds up a mirror to ourselves to say, how is labor management relations working in Tennessee? And the idea is not just for me to tell you about these ideas, but for you to look at your own data and for us to have a conversation in which you lift up the region as a region and talk about it. So with that in mind, the 4 principles that will underline what I'll be saying, the first is it's easier to be negative. It's harder to be positive in how you approach labor management relations, and it's crucial that we do. But the first challenge is the forces of entropy in a labor management relationship always default to people playing to the audience, people being political, people engaging in things that are negative rather than positive. And so it's a constant struggle to hold ourselves to a higher standard. That's one of the thoughts that will underlie what I'll be saying. The second is that labor and management have both common and competing interests. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that there will always be conflict. There will always be dividing the pie kinds of things that happen between labor and management. And there will always be opportunities to expand the pie, opportunities to identify and pursue mutual interest. It's a both and. And so everything that we talk about isn't about everyone holding hands and singing Kumbaya. It's about hard bargaining, dealing with hard issues, but being hard on the issues, not each other. And about doing so in a way that when you, after you've divided the pie, you haven't spilled half of it on the floor, you can expand it. And so I'll come back to that in a little bit. But the last point, and this is going to be the underlying point, is that the institutions matter. The rules of the road matter. And right now we have institutions that aren't fully working. And so we're going to be talking about that as well. So that's kind of the underlying principles. To set the stage, I'm going to do something that probably every speaker in Terra does, which is go back to the 1400s in France, around 1450. It's a pretty common topic of discussion. This is a French tapestry from right around that time, right around 1450. And you can see it's a picture that has the church, it has the military, it has the state on it. The reason I have this up here is because it was right around the middle 1400s in France that the word institution, I'm told, was coined. Think about it. For 500 to 1,000 years in the West, the church, the military, the state, monarchies, things like that had existed, and we didn't even have a word for them. They were so slow to change, so taken for granted, so much part of the context that the word institution didn't even exist. If you fast forward, this is a picture of the shop floor of the Auburn Motor Company at the turn of the last century. How many of you heard of Auburn Motors? We have a couple people here, I would think, yeah? What do we know about Auburn? Anybody? They made pretty good cars. The Auburn, the Cord, they were good cars. At the time of this picture, and by the way, they were located, surprisingly, in Auburn, Indiana. In fact, if you drive through Indiana, you can see the Auburn Car Museum. It's right there. At the time of this picture, it was one of 140 car companies just in the state of Indiana. You had literally dozens and dozens of carriage manufacturers that wanted to become car companies. And if you look at this picture, they got parts of it right. There's some interchangeable parts in the background. This is the axle assembly area, but they didn't get the moving assembly. Almost got it, are now footnotes to history. 3 hands out of this room that have even heard of Auburn Motors. The folks that got the system right are, of course, the household names, Fords and others, that defined the last century. The reason I have this picture here is for 2 reasons. First, by the time of this picture, the pace of change in institutions had accelerated. It wasn't 500 to 1,000 years, it was 50 to 100 years that unions, political parties, constitutional monarchies, Elks Clubs, Lions Clubs, a whole lot of institutional arrangements came into existence at the first industrial divide. And in the space of 1 or 2 lifetimes, 50 to 100 years, the institutions completely changed. The rules of the game changed. The second reason I have this up here is that it's increasingly evident that we're now living in the second industrial divide. You can call it a post-industrial society. You can call it an information age, a globalization, a knowledge-driven economy. History will tell us ultimately what this era is labeled as. But the one thing that I'm sure of is that the pace of technological change has accelerated, and that the pace of institutional change is accelerating along with it. And that's my main point, which is it's not 50 to 100 years, but it looks like it's more like 5 to 10 years, an order of magnitude faster, that the very ground can shift under our feet. We can go in 10 years from a majority defined benefit to a majority defined contribution pension plan as a nation. Fundamental changes, the role of unions in the public sector is on the table in ways that could spin and is spinning in lots of ways. And the point is, it's within a lifetime that the institutions change. And so the big part of my agenda, my talk today, is to help you to figure out how to navigate a world where it's not just that small things are changing, but the institutions themselves are changing within 5 to 10 year horizons. So with that in mind, I have a quote here from a fellow named Eric Trist. He was one of the founders of a movement called the Socio-Technical Systems Movement in the 70s and 80s. And at the time he said, this was 1969, if you can believe it, he said, we're moving to another type of society. It's sometimes called a new service society, a second industrial revolution, a post-industrial society. He cautions that there is no guarantee of our safe arrival. Dr. Deming used to caution all of us that he said survival is not guaranteed. And so that's you could be the Auburn Motor Companies, or you could be the Ford Motor Companies of the next era, and success is not guaranteed. But the important thing is, he says, the interdependencies are greater, they're differently structured, and they demand a new mobilization of the sciences. That is, we have to think through the ideas that are behind what's going on in deep ways, and that's what this conversation is about, because the way we understand what's going on matters. Now, you can take any part of our nation's infrastructure system, take the power grid, take the air transportation system, take the system for responding to national disasters, take the internet. In every one of these systems and countless others, the institutions that were forged in the 20th century based on the Industrial Revolution kind of thinking don't map on to the requirements of the 21st. I'll say it again. The institutions don't map on to the requirements of the systems. One of my old friends from the UAW used to say, first you need to get all the liars in the room. And at the system level, you can't even get the stakeholders in a room on a regular basis to have a conversation about what's needed. So the things that we're going to talk about the institutions and systems of labor relations, in fact, apply much more broadly. Now, let's just look at, on the labor management side. First, this is a chart that I put together with some data from EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, and it helps to understand some of the challenge that we're facing with the labor and employment institutions. What this is a chart that starts in 1947 and goes to 2007, and it's a scale with an index in terms of consumer purchasing power and productivity that starts at 100. And this green line is productivity. And basically you can see that for the entire last half century, productivity in this nation has gone up at about a 3% rate year over year, and it's been steady. That's good news. Here's the concern. This blue line is average wages. And from the period of 1947 to about mid-1970s, wages and productivity matched. How many of you have heard of the annual improvement factor? Folks here from the auto industry have. The annual improvement factor was a very basic, very powerful idea. The idea was that people would get a cost of living increase to match the cost of living, and then wages would go up approximately equivalent to the increase in productivity. So if you had a 3% gain in productivity, there would be a 3% gain in wages. And the point is, not all of the value of productivity went to the workforce. There was profits for the company as well. But that 3% meant that what labor was contributing to growth was showing up in the paycheck. It was a formula that built a middle class for this nation. Unfortunately, what happened here was, for a variety of things, happened in the late 70s and early 80s that served to undermine labor purchasing power. It was new technology, it was globalization, it was declining of unions. There were a variety of factors going on, but wages went flat. So what happened is a lot of households, women went to work if they weren't working already. And so this purple line is household income. And you can see for a period of time, even as wages started to go flat, household earnings continued to match productivity gains. That's because you had a second wage earner entering the workforce. Unfortunately, there weren't third and fourth wage earners to enter the workforce. We do still outlaw child labor. And so around the around 1980, in the 1980s, household earnings went flat. And this gap in purchasing power, what happened is people started taking on more debt, and eventually we hit the wall. And that was what a big part. I mean, the last recession had some bad behavior in finance and what have you, but underlying it was a deep instability because consumer purchasing power hadn't grown and debt had increased, and we finally reached that gap. I would argue that this is a story that the institutions had broken down. On the labor management side, a lot of people say the problem is Ronald Reagan fired the flight controllers and everything went downhill from there. Well, I actually think there was a more subtle thing that happened during Reagan's presidency that was much more consequential, which is he branded labor as a special interest. And labor never took that on. Unions in the public sector is a political move, not an economic move, and so on. I believe that in order to regain that high ground, and we're going to get to this in a few minutes, you really need to come back to these public goods in fundamentally new and different ways. But let me put another piece on the puzzle. This is sort of going off the screen. What I'll do is I'll move it up so you can see it. So what I want to emphasize is that there's a positive side to this. If we look at data from a study by Lynch and Black and Lynch, Lisa Lynch and Sandra Black, they basically did a national study on productivity looking at union and non-union enterprises. What they found is that they classified both the union and the non-union enterprises as sort of traditional or what I would call transformational. And they set the traditional personnel style non-union business as 0 in terms of productivity. And what they found is that if you had a traditional adversarial union management relationship, productivity was actually 15% lower. So those employers that are anti-union and view unions as work rules and as just impediments to productivity, well, if it's a traditional old-style adversarial relationship on a productivity dimension, they're right. It's actually 15% less productive. That doesn't mean that there aren't other things being gained by those unions, but on a pure productivity basis, it's less productive. If you go to a high-performance non-union enterprise, team-based, selection, training, all of the HRM practices in an advanced non-union setting that you see, that's actually 15% more productive than the traditional HR, personnel, old-style non-union enterprise. But here's the interesting thing. If you look at a high-performance work system that's unionized, so also with the team-based work system, with the training, with the other things, it's actually 20% more productive. And so there's the story. If union and management are working together in a transformational way. And by the way, you'll hear from the folks at Louisville that it's hard work every day to make that happen. It doesn't just say, okay, now we're going to partnership and let's coast, because there's hard issues on a daily basis to stay on that dimension. But the point is, with the union as a partner, it's actually the most robust arrangement possible. And it's really what this nation contemplated when we passed the National Labor Relations Act. And that's really what this chart, if we want to get this line paired with this line, that's part of the story, is what do we do with the institutions. So now let me get to this issue of the public good. In 1951, George Taylor, an advisor to 6 U.S. presidents, the head of the Wartime Labor Board during World War II, really one of the leaders and founders of the whole idea of arbitration in our society. In 1951, he warned that collective bargaining was dependent upon the union and management voluntarily giving broad weight to the public interest. At the time, he was worried about sweetheart deals between companies and unions that would basically raise prices and hurt the consumer. And that if labor and management did that, the public would not support the institution of collective bargaining. What I'm here to tell you is that we're less worried about that as we are about the very existence of collective bargaining as an institution. And my argument is that we need to come back to this idea of the public interest. So let me give you an idea of what I mean. This is an example of some contract language in the public sector from a teacher's school district. What I'd like you to do is just read this language for a minute. The district and the association agree to take responsibility to be held accountable for improvement in the quality of teaching and learning, shared responsibility. As you read through this, I'd like you to hear just from you for a minute, what do you notice that's interesting or important about this as a collective bargaining agreement? Okay, you see the word shared. What else do you notice? What strikes you as interesting or important that they would sit at the bargaining table, negotiate this kind of language, and put it in their contract? Okay, the words mutual respect stand out. Don't underestimate the importance of foundational principles like mutual respect. What else? Okay, you see trust. What do you think it would take to implement language like this? It would take honesty, absolutely. What else? What? Patience. But give it. What? Yeah, you're describing some of the attitudes behind it, but go a step further. Yeah, but what infrastructure would you need? Who would you need to train? What would you need to do to make this language work? So both parties have to be involved. It's not self-implementing. You can't write the language and give it to payroll and say, process the salary increase. Both sides are going to be on the ground to make this happen. What kinds of things will be happening on the ground? Okay, probably there's training, because there's some basic skills that you want to have shared across the different school buildings, elementary schools, junior high schools. What else? You're going to have some mechanisms for communication. If it's not working quite right, you have to be able to have people give you upward feedback, saying you wrote this language, but it's not happening in our building. What else? Okay, one of the first things you'd want to do is what we call a stakeholder map. You've got parents, you've got teachers, you've got administrators, you've got students, you've got community folks, you've got bus drivers. There's lots of different folks that are going to be stakeholders to deliver, that have a stake in educational outcomes. And if you really want this to work, you got to get them lined up, working together on this task. And we could go on, but my point about this is, in the public sector for teachers, if collective bargaining is going to be valued, it's not enough just to deliver wages, hours, and working conditions. It's important, it's crucial, it's part of that consumer purchasing power that I was talking about a minute ago, but it's not enough. It's necessary but not sufficient. It's also important to be able to say to the public that you're at the table. Your interests are at the table. In fact, I would argue, at least in the public sector, it wouldn't hurt to have a public open forum period before the beginning of bargaining to let the public come and express their views for the parties to take them into account. I'm not saying that you put the public at the table, but you have to have some way of saying, well, what's important to the public, because they have a stake in what's happening at the table. For police and fire, I would say it's the same conversation, but with public safety. And the real challenge is even in the private sector, on community impacts, on area economic vitality, on skills training, on jobs, job creation, on environmental issues. There are a number of issues where the public has a stake in what happens in collective bargaining. And here's the real challenge. In today's divided, cynical society, is it enough for labor and management to say to the public, oh yes, we care about you, we are thinking about you? I would say no. I would say the public says, let me see what you put in your contract, let me see what you're doing day to day in your behaviors that tells me that the public interest is on the table, is being accounted for. If you were in the San Juan and you saw this language and you were a citizen, what would you think? Would you be happy to see the folks are at least having this conversation? Yeah. That's my challenge to you today. My challenge to you is that in your labor management relationships, can you produce tangible indicators that say to the public, you're also taking into account the public interest? I believe if we don't achieve that, collective bargaining itself will be seen as a special interest. I mean, we have the former chair of the National Labor Relations Board, Wilma Liebman, visiting in our school this semester. And she's teaching a class on the kind of frontiers of labor law, the issues that are sort of at the frontier. And she asked the students, how many of you know what a picket line is? 3 hands went up. Most people didn't have a clue. And so basic part, you know, a picket line was once seen as part of this enterprise of growing a middle class. Now it's seen as a narrow special interest of people just trying to get more. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I think that's part of the consumer purchasing power, but it's not enough. It's not enough for society to say collective bargaining is a valued institution. And remember I said, 5 to 10 years, whole institutions can change under ourselves. We need to be thinking about what it takes to make this institution self-renewing, because if it isn't, it will be deteriorating. And by the way, the measure of an institution is twofold. It has to do 2 things. It has to both create value and mitigate harm. And it has to deal with all these issues of sustainability, agility, and so on. But let me come back to those 2 issues. When institutions don't mitigate harm, it used to be that they had what were called externalities. So pollution and other things are externalities of the system. These days, if institutions aren't functioning right, it's not just that there are externalities or extra bad things that we're not taking into account. There can be catastrophic system failures. So if the institutions around the power grid don't work, we get rolling blackouts. If the institutions on the air transportation system don't work, we're stuck with ground-based and we never get to satellite-based air transportation. If the institutions of collective bargaining don't work, we don't just have declining real wages, we have catastrophic collapses like we just went through. And the other side of it is institutions don't just mitigate harm, they should create value, that they should be helping to expand the pie. And so the real question that we need to ask ourselves is, how do we construct labor management institutions that do the best job possible of creating value for all the parties and mitigating harm, especially mitigating catastrophic systems failures? So let me stop there. What I'd like to do is shift gears and take you on a journey to look at your own data. I'm sorry. I don't know if you can say I'm sorry to a plant, but that's right. But let me pass these around. What I'm passing around are copies of some of the preliminary survey results from the survey that a number of you participated in the last couple of days. And I apologize for the short notice in the survey. It was actually only recently that Susan Helper was not able to join you for the program, and I agreed to come. And so in talking about it, I suggested to Bill that I've been doing research under a National Science Foundation grant to look at lots of different institutions and to look at this issue of what we call stakeholder alignment within the institutions. And so here's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to walk you through the data. You have it there as a reference, but I'm going to actually, if you look up at the screen, share with you a new way to visually represent the data. So you're going to see some new things here, as well as what you have. First of all, recognize that we only had 19 respondents, so it's a low response rate. There's about 200 people on your district mailing list, so it's about a 10% response rate. By the way, if you got the email with the link to the survey, and you probably got 5 of them, you can still fill it out. And in fact, I would encourage you to do so. We'll check to see if the results are different from people who saw this briefing versus not. But I think it's still valid to get as much data as we can, and so I encourage you to do so. But among the respondents, we had about 37% labor, 16% management, 47% either neutral or academic or other. The majority of the folks had over 20 years experience, so this is a very experienced group of folks giving us their views. It was about 1/3 women, 2/3 men. About 72% of the respondents had served on bargaining committees, and about slightly more than half had been through some kind of negotiations training. So that gives you an idea of who's responding to the survey. I'm going to focus on giving you the responses to the answers, but don't be limited to that. We're going to want to hear your views as well. So first of all, we asked people, how would you describe the labor management climate in Tennessee? And we said use words or phrases. And so the words or phrases we got were bittersweet, difficult, you catch more flies with honey, hostile, distrustful, authoritarian, deceptive, feudal, cordial, a mile wide and an inch shallow, very contentious, in the middle of an unresolved debate about the role of labor. My favorite, stinky baby. Tennessee, not so much as Kentucky. Too combative, carry on my wayward son, and challenging. So in change management, you have to map the current state before you get to the desired state. This is some of the words that people use to describe the current state. When we ask people, what about the desired state? What would be a vision of success for labor management relations in this region? They said, well, if the economy gets better, at least we would have a more balanced playing field. If we can eliminate greed in both the public and private sectors, but we need to stick together. We need to align the interest and get agreement on goals. We need to repeal the right to work legislation and fund a labor management education research center. I can't imagine why that would be important to anyone here. Interest-based bargaining, comprehensive dispute resolution programs, just cause, not at-will employment, training. Prior to any initiative, do some planning. It depends on a vast improvement in the economy. We need better institutions. The National Labor Relations Board needs to be strengthened. We need respect for the reciprocal relationship, working towards a common interest. We need to have bargaining be less of a single event and more of an ongoing process. We need to recognize the worth of integrative bargaining. Basically, we need workable agreements and then training for supervisors to follow. So the vision of success, in one hand, is very tangible, not wild and crazy, but also something that's very different than the way people describe the current state. So there's a gap, and how do we close the gap from the current state to the desired state? In 1986, Tom Koch and Harry Katz and Bob McKersey wrote a book in which they said the way we transform labor management relations is a three-level conversation. That you have to change relations at the day-to-day workplace level, change relations at collective bargaining, and change relations at the strategic level. And certainly in the things that we're talking about here today, we'll be touching on some things at all three levels, but I'm going to focus especially at the collective bargaining level. And to do so, I want to import a basic principle from Lean Six Sigma thinking. This is a dart game, a hypothetical dart game, and of course you get more points for being closer to the bullseye. Which dart player has the higher score in this round? The one on the left or the right? Who has the higher score? The one on the left, right? You see that? Who would you rather coach to improve? Yeah, if you say to the one on the left, go up a little, go down a little, whatever you tell them, you're going to get more noise, where you know exactly what you want to say to this one, right? And the point is, where there's variation in a system, you can't improve things until you reduce the variation. And so I'm going to ask you to think about collective bargaining as a system. And I'm going to present you some of your own data that's going to suggest that there's a lot of variation. And how do we reduce the variation to then drive improvement? Cautionary note, this is preliminary data, small response rate. There's some new visuals coming, but more work would be needed to work with the data. But the basic idea is that in every system, if you think of many different interests that are at stake and many different stakeholders, let's imagine each stakeholder in this square heat map is a row and each column is an interest, you can have a matrix or a map of stakeholders and interest. And essentially that's what I'm going to be sharing with you, is some data in which each interest, each issue has a vector or a set of stakeholders, and we're going to see where they're aligned and where they're not. So the I'm going the wrong direction. So the visualization that I'm going to show you works as follows. Imagine a whole group of stakeholders. We're going to assign each one of them a hexagon. And we're going to color code it so those who have positive views are green, neutral views are yellow, and negative views are red. And for those of you that are colorblind, we're working on a colorblind palette to go with this. But I do apologize in advance. Although I will tell you a story. I presented this technology with some work we're doing on the future of the geosciences in the country. And one of the leaders at the National Climate Research Observatory in Denver is colorblind, and particularly has a blue-green colorblind. And he did tell me that his colorblindness was very valuable during World War II, because they used to put these people like him in the bottom of bombers because they didn't see blue-green. When enemy camouflage was put over an installation, they didn't see it, and so they could actually locate the enemy. So blue-green colorblindness has its limits, but it also has its virtues. But at any rate, what we're going to do is, if we take people's responses to a question, we can take their responses and do the color coding, and if it's on a scale from 0 to 1, you can get a mean, and then you can line up the responses from the ones closest to the middle, closest to the mean, to the outliers, which could be above or below. I'm taking the time to do this to show you, because I'm going to take the responses to each question and put them in what we call a Z-flower, where we tile the responses in a spiral from the mean out, so that the ones in the middle are close to the mean, on the outside are literally outliers. So if everyone is positive on something, it's going to look all green. If everyone is mixed or bimodal, you'll see some yellow and some green. And if it's a complete mix of views, you'll see some red, some yellow, and some green. And that way you're going to be having on your paper there, you have the means, which just gives you the middle response. But I'm going to show you, in a sense, all of the stakeholder responses on an issue. So let's take something very basic, the training of supervisors and managers in this region. We asked, how would you rate the training of supervisors and managers? And the folks from labor, on a scale from 0 to 100, gave it a 39 or a 40. The folks from management gave it a 50. They were a little more positive. The neutrals and the others gave it a 21 out of 100. So the current level of training and supervisors is not great. And if you look at this chart for the current level of training of supervisors, what you see is there are 2 folks here who answered with a scale close to 90 or 100, very positive green, and there's 6 that gave almost a 0, very negative red. And then there's a bunch of folks in the middle. And so while it's helpful to see that on average people are saying we need work to do in training, I would say that there's some bright spots here where some folks are saying, yeah, there are good things going that you want to lift up and say, how do we understand? And there are some folks here who are really hurting, who are saying, we've got a real problem, and you need to understand what their reality is. We then said, in 3 to 5 years, how good could it get? Not what would be the ideal, but what's realistic if you made great progress in 3 to 5 years. Well, the labor respondents said we could at least get from a 39 or 40 to a 65 out of 100. Management thought it could be more like a 73, and the neutrals said we might get to 41. And if you look at the chart, in fact, only 2 folks are still somewhat negative, and a lot more folks are more positive about the potential. And so this is the gap. And what you're seeing is that this is an issue in which no one is saying we shouldn't improve, and in fact there's room to make progress. We then asked about the training of union leaders. And the responses were very similar. The labor folks actually said that they thought they were more like a 42. Management also thought it was right around a 50 out of 100, and the neutrals around a 33. Whereas management thought that supervisors could, in 3 to 5 years, get up to a 73. Labor said the training of union leaders, if things went well, could get up to a 71. And if you look at the map, in the current state, there's again a couple of folks that are pretty positive, a lot of folks that are negative, but again, the map of the future is very similar on the management side. And so on this issue of training supervisors, managers, and training union leaders, what folks here are saying is the current state is problematic and it's bimodal. It's really bad with a couple of bright spots. The future state, everyone's pretty much in agreement that we could make a pretty substantial, almost doubling of where we see things if we made a good effort in 3 to 5 years. Let's go to the next issue. We asked about this question of social dialogue. Social dialogue are mechanisms for, mechanisms for cooperation, consensus building. The labor folks said we were around a 33, management a 54, and the neutrals about a 32. Everyone is in agreement that we might get up to around a 60 out of 100. The neutrals more like a 47. And if you look at the Z-flower, you can see that even on this dimension, there were 3 stakeholders that said somewhat positive on social dialogue, and then quite a few that said real negative. Here's the concern. Even in 3 to 5 years, we had 4 of the stakeholders who said still not possible to make major progress with social dialogue. And so the real question is, how can we understand what people are seeing as the barriers? Because we know from Kurt Lewin, one of the original social science theorists who invented this notion called force field analysis. He said you can look at the driving and restraining forces for change, and here's his key insight. He said if you push harder on the drivers, you don't necessarily get change. If you remove the barriers, the drivers will do what they need to do. And in fact, when you remove barriers, like if one of the barriers to training is the lack of joint union management commitment to support regional training for union and management. If you remove that barrier, you've created a driver. So the coaching advice is when you're trying to do systems change is don't just push harder on the drivers, ask what are the barriers and what you can do to remove the barriers, because that's where you get more leverage. But what we're saying here is on social dialogue, we need to understand some of those barriers, because even in 3 to 5 years, there are some folks that are saying they're concerned, but there's a lot of other people that are optimistic. And by the way, in terms of overall labor force skills training, in general, there are 2 stakeholders that say things are bad, but a number that say we're either neutral or okay, and everyone is in agreement that in 3 to 5 years you could be better. So that's a motherhood apple pie issue. Everyone's going to agree on workforce skills training in the region. We asked about trust both in the public and private sector. We didn't get enough responses on the question in the public sector. I think it was the first question on the survey instrument, and some people must have been confused filling it out. So I don't want to report that because there's too much missing data. But on the private sector, basically, well, you can see this. We have 3 stakeholders that are being positive about the level of trust in the private sector, and about more than half that are really negative. That overall, that was given a 31, a 55, and a 30 out of 100. In the public sector, we asked about information sharing, and particularly on the union side, 19 out of 100, management 48, 35. And on both of these dimensions, even though people are saying that things could improve, there are some stakeholders that are cautious about that. So again, we need to understand both the bright spots where people do have trust and are building it, and some of the areas where people see barriers. Labor standards. We asked people where are we at with labor standards compliance, and again, the responses are all in the 30 to 50 range for where we're at. And the potential, though, for improvement is, almost half again, 50, 70. And so people see that as an area where you could make improvement in terms of basic, paying people for overtime and what have you. And we asked a very interesting question. How would you rate the private sector services and products that are being produced now? And a couple people were negative, most were positive. But we said if we made good progress with collective bargaining, what could happen to products and services? And everyone said that they could improve. The responses are from 59 to 72, from 70 to 78, from 53 to 66. So, direct linkage, collective bargaining to products and services, people are at least seeing some potential. The last set of questions that we asked were this issue that I raised with you at the outset, putting the public interest on the table. To what degree in the public sector does labor take into account the public interest and management? Union respondents said 29 out of 100, management said 56, neutral said 28. If things went really well in 3 to 5 years, 29 could become 42, 56 could become 73, 28 could become 42. And what's interesting is even in the private sector, the union folks said we're now at about a 37 out of 100, but it could become 50. Management said we're at a 54 and it could become 70. The neutral said we're at 33 and it could become 44. So folks are seeing that there's a potential in 3 to 5 years to put the public interest on the table and improve things. And so I would argue that it's just like the conversation we had about the teachers. Not just could you improve things, but how would you do it? What would it take? I'm going to stop here. Well, actually, I'm going to show you one more bit of data, which is we asked people a whole bunch of behaviors for where things are at, and this was on a scale of 0 to 6. And some of them are things like taking hard positions in the media or joint training, a more negative versus a more positive kind of thing. And you can see all the responses were around a 2 or a 3. You have all this data on the 3rd page of the handout there. We asked people about a lot of behaviors during bargaining, both negative and positive, joint problem solving, by the way, taking hard positions isn't negative, but going to the media, I would argue, is crossing a line. And then some things after bargaining as well. You have all the data there. The key thing that I'm going to point out is on every dimension, positive or negative, you are in the kind of 2 or 3 range out of a scale from 0 to 6. So some of the really bad behaviors aren't necessarily being seen as very frequent, but some of the really positive, constructive behaviors aren't necessarily being seen as frequent either. And so I want you to sort of think about that as well. Now, I have some closing remarks that I want to share with you, but I'm going to actually pause here and ask you to do something unusual, which is take 5 minutes at your table. I assume you probably already said hello to the people you're sitting with, but take about 5 minutes just to talk about the data. I've given you feedback, held up the mirror to say, for Tennessee and for this region, here's your data. What I'd like you to do is have a conversation at your table. What strikes you as interesting or important? What do you see here that's meaningful? And then I'm going to open it up to the full group. But begin the conversation at your table. Go for it. We're going to continue the conversation, but we'll continue it as a full group. We have a prominent UAW leader working out of classification who's got a microphone. And so I'm going to have him sort of go to each table and just get maybe one comment per table. We'll start with this table right here. What do you notice that strikes you as interesting or important about the data?
Ask people, identify yourself before you have a comment.
There's a question. I have a question. Check marks.
Okay.
On the issue of labor and management, taking interest in the public good. Okay. Other than because we have a tendency, all of us, to live in an echo chamber, and what's good for the public is what's good for me. But just in general, that's I think is human nature. What should labor and management be doing to identify exactly what is the public good in any particular situation, as opposed to just making assumptions based upon their own good?
It's a really important question. By the way, I'll take some notes here, which I'll also give to Bill. What I like about your question is implicit in it is the notion that we shouldn't just make assumptions and assume that we know what the public good is. That we should ask. And so I don't think if you're in a plant that's going into bargaining, it would necessarily compromise either side if 6 months before bargaining you held a public forum open to the community to say, help us to understand your concerns about this plant in your community, your hopes and your fears. By the way, I would insist on making it positive as well as any negatives, and encourage people to have a conversation not about what their criticisms are, but about in 3 to 5 years, if things went well for this plant in this community, what would success look like for you? So encourage people to give you their positive assessment as to what they see is in their interest. What would it mean? Would it mean that there are some jobs for the next generation of kids? Would it mean that there's skills training? But in a sense, ask the question, but ask the question in a way that doesn't just encourage people to complain, but actually encourages people to be positive about what's possible. So that would be one piece of the puzzle. I would also say, in public or private sector, the odds are that you have lots of people in your facilities who are engaged in the community, who are in United Way, who are doing community engagement projects of various kinds. And I would encourage them to speak from their experience, to help within the organization to say, well, what do you know? What are you encountering? And so you have an internal dialogue about that as well. And 80% of what comes up will not be a surprise, but in that 10 or 20% of new ideas, there might be just some ideas that really have mileage. So I really appreciate the question. I see a comment here.
Yeah, mine is, I'm Joan with the United Steelworkers International. My comment, I think, in my mind the question, what would be the public interest? If there's going to be language proposed, I guess I'm more practical. Language proposed at the bargaining table, somebody's got to define what the public interest is. So that, there's not going to become a dispute later on and somebody says, well, if we're doing this, well, that's not in the public interest, but, that violates the contract. If we're supposed to be cooperative and consider the public good, I think we need to define the public good. By example, in this community meeting may help set those parameters, or at least give a definition to that phrase.
And I want to be clear that the majority of the time of labor and management should be devoted to the work of labor and management within the four walls of the enterprise. There's a lot of hard work to be done to have a productive and successful enterprise and to properly represent the people that elected you. But what I'm suggesting is some percentage of your time and energy should also go into figuring out these public goods, and it's a new kind of conversation. But it's a conversation in which I believe if we don't do that, the institution itself is at risk. Because the public can easily say, we don't have a stake in this, you're not taking into account our interest, we'll figure out other ways to have the rights of workers represented in our society. Yes?
I'm kind of like Ms. Hill. Don't see how you could put that in a contract with the public interest, but I would be more of an informative side, having your city leaders there right before negotiations. Because a lot of times they're not aware of the things that the company's done for the community. Also, they're not sure what the union has done in the community. And sometimes when you sit down and you make people aware of exactly what all you've done during the year, from both sides, from the company and the union standpoint, what you've done, then people have more understanding. At least you are doing something in the community. A lot of times they're just not aware.
Yeah, I think that's another part about this, a crucial part. I think the first part of this conversation is turning up the volume on what you're already doing. The folks here from Louisville are building ramps for handicapped people to get into homes. It's something that makes a powerful difference in people's lives, but how many people in the Louisville area know that they're doing that? So there's probably a lot of things that you're doing. When Marty and Jimmy get up, ask them about the severance package for the people that were let go during this last recession. What they will tell you is that it was a package that if every company and union in this nation displaced people with that kind of a care and attention, the recession would not have been as bad as it was. Jimmy or Marty, what was the kind of standard package that people had? If you could get the microphone over to them for a minute.
We offered a variety of packages. If you're not retirement eligible, if you're not retirement eligible, it's $100,000. But we also offered, Jimmy and I, this education opportunity program, which was a $15,000 for 4 years, which covers your tuition, plus half your pay, plus you receive full health care benefits, and if you had a $50,000 life insurance policy. So, and we had people we had every place from Harvard to University of Michigan to people going into practical application training units.
Thanks, Marty. I actually was Bob King to help negotiate that. I was at another assignment at that particular time, but we copied it. We had a similar situation at another corporation, American Axle, and it was people were very appreciative. They had like 6 opportunities to say what they wanted to do. They also was a lump sum buyout period, as well as and also a growing. You had less than 30 years, you couldn't qualify within a 4-year growing. So it was very humane and very well accepted by membership of the community.
And no, everyone, union and management, feels the pain when you're laying people off and there's displacement. But just imagine if across this nation, when people were let go in the recession, what went with it was either a $100,000 buyout package or $15,000 towards tuition, 4 years of half salary, and health care. I mean, the impact across the economy, when I talk about public goods, there was a substantial public good that was created by the way the union and the management at UAW and Ford handled that displacement, because less of a burden was put on communities. And it's a turn up the volume issue. I don't think they ever fully got credit for just how big an impact that was in the communities where they were located. Yes?
And thinking about that, my name is John Markins, I'm an arbitrator. In thinking about what has caused this misalignment in the institutions, going back to the original thoughts, it seems that what's driven the transformation in a lot of ways is competition. Whether it's external factors, the global competition in the public sector, it's contracting out. In the education sector, it's the growth of charter schools and the demands for in new institutions that are challenging the public institutions in providing education. And I'm wondering if there's data out there that shows whether there's a correlation between those bargaining partners who use the cooperative approach or integrated bargaining or however you want to make their interest, and have developed that relationship as a result of an external threat, and basically it's a means of survival.
It's a really important point. Dick Walton, who was one of the early thinkers about high commitment work systems, described what he called a golden middle. He said, on one side, if everything is, fat and happy, there's no need to change. If things are so bad on the other side that there just aren't even the resources to do a buyout package or to do kinds of things, it's really difficult. But there's a sort of golden middle in which things are unfrozen, but there's still some capacity to think differently and innovate. And so I think you're right, that where we see change, where we see new institutional innovation, there generally is some unfreezing. My argument, and it goes back to that opening story about the Sterling Axle plant, is it can also happen with leadership. You don't have to wait for a crisis to unfreeze things in order to have a conversation about how we can improve. And in fact, I think we should be having those kinds of conversations more. Because if you look at the data, the gap between where we are and where we could be is the unfreezing. But then it's a leadership conversation. Yes?
My name is Dave Jenkins,
Yeah.
Stakeholders. Comparing what the UAW and Ford was able to negotiate for the buyout packages is wonderful. Compare that to Nissan North America and Smart Tennessee. Their buyout package was a fraction of that.
Yeah.
Their insurance was almost nil. Their insurance multiplier was nowhere near the industry standard. I think they received $50,000.
See, I'm not going to sit here and say anything negative about another company, but what I will say, yeah, no, and I mean, I have a long history of knowing the folks at Ford, and I respect what they stand for, so I'm not a neutral commentator. But what I will say is, as big as it is, Ford is still a family-owned firm. And there still is a piece about that of ownership that says we need to do things right. And so there's a value piece of this puzzle which, frankly, we don't celebrate enough in our society. Because there are lots of folks in management who try to do the right thing, and we don't always give credit when that happens. So in a sense, part of this conversation is celebrating the folks that are doing more than the minimum. Yeah.
Bill Canning, NPSC. I would like to suggest John Martin's comment and question. Got me thinking about public good in this other sense education systems. That these are public goods for a nation, and to the extent that